Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that C for classic, known as Sleeping Beauty. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, here recording live from Sleeping Beauty Castle. That's right, in Disneyland. I'm at the very top of that particular place. It's very lonely here. Not a lot of the staff comes up. I keep asking for Goofy, and he doesn't come up here. I'm so pissed off about it.
Hello, I am Bryan, and I don't think my son likes your daughter.
Oh, yes. Welcome everyone to our inaugural full episode of our 3rd season. This one being about Disney, as we announced in our previous little mini episode that we released the previous week. And I think it's fair, like we said this in our mini episode, but I really want to emphasize it here for the first big episode of the season. We do not condone everything the Disney company does. We're not going to be effusively praising Disney as a corporation as much as examining the wide breadth of their film output, especially, we're recording this mere, moments after the SAG strike officially ended. We should mention. That just, you aren't,
What?
You weren't aware.
Wait, what?
Yes, they've reached a deal, moments before we started recording.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. Real time. Bryan finds out.
I was reading before we started this episode, so, yeah, I didn't see that. That's, hell yeah, okay. Sorry, go on.
Yes, but, Disney is one of many studios who have been treating not just actors, but, writers and visual effects artists unfairly.
Yep.
Even just people who run their fucking theme park. Guys, they make the most money for you, usually. Just, don't pay them below minimum wage or whatever bullshit you want to do.
Right, and just all the horror stories you hear of, working at Disney and stuff like that, which I've heard of from, people I know. Yeah, Disney's not a great company, but, they have put out a lot of movies, and, I think there's a reason they have become, an institution, an American institution, and, the movies, I don't know.
This goes all the way back with Disney, given their namesake Walt, who we'll be talking about today because this is one of, we decided very firmly when we were going to do our C for Classic for this season, we wanted to do one where Walt was alive, which would have been all the way up until 1966. He passes away, so pretty much anything that he was involved in, Jungle Book prior, we figured.
Right.
And, it's important to talk about Walt Disney is a fascinating just figure in his own right, given, obviously, he managed to create this company with the help of various people he didn't either pay fairly or correctly credit for certain things. He is fascinating just because, the image that I had of Walt Disney ever since I was very young was just he's the guy who was, sort of the grandfatherly figure. The guy who sort of was behind all of these great characters, like Mickey Mouse and all these other people. And it's very curious, especially, when you read up more about Walt Disney and his, like I mentioned, sort of the big labor practices in particular were a big thing for him. I watched, as part of weird research, this movie, The Reluctant Dragon, which I don't know if have you heard of this? Are you aware of what this is?
No, it does not ring up any bells.
So it follows this guy, Robert Benchley, who was a real, satirist and comedian and stuff like that, basically going to the Walt Disney Studios to pitch this titular premise of The Reluctant Dragon. So it's a lot of him walking around the Walt Disney studio lot of the time. And
Okay.
talking to people who claim like, oh, I'm an animator, I'm a sound effects artist, but really I'm an actor because we're not going to have those people out here, particularly the animators who were striking at the time.
Right. Okay.
Yes. Right. So it's very much a propaganda machine movie, just about like, wow, the Walt Disney Studio is so great. And it's all about him trying to find Walt by the very end of it, who's just like in a screening room, like, yeah, do this, do this. I'm smoking a cigarette. Yeah, okay, let's play The Reluctant Dragon, which we apparently made in the time that you were at the studio. Like, in the afternoon, we managed to finish The Reluctant Dragon, the premise the guy was going to pitch to us. It's really weird.
Strange. Yeah.
Strange. But that's the kind of like imagery stuff where if you think like right now, like, oh, Disney and their like propaganda machines and their like image focused stuff, that's been going on since the beginning, guys. It's been a thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And especially, I mean, growing up in Florida, I feel like I got so much of that. I don't know about you, but I got like so much of just like that, like Disney is a very like family company and all of that propaganda stuff that they have, yeah, just been doing so for so long.
Right. And particularly with any clips that they would show of Walt would be stuff from like his openings for like the Wonderful World of Disney and the World of Color and stuff like that. Where it just became like,
Right.
oh, hello everybody, here's a look at our latest picture that's going to be coming out soon. And stuff like that. That he had that
Right.
kind of like grandfatherly image about himself. The more you look into it, especially even like with this movie we're going to be talking about, it's weird how despite the fact that this is like the one we chose for around the time Walt was like working on stuff, at this time he was very distracted from like Sleeping Beauty. Because he, like around 55, like in the 50s is where Disney starts really getting away from sort of like production, like film production stuff and going way more into like the theme parks or television specifically. Where that's like the new toys that he gives a shit about. And he was
Right.
not very satisfied apparently with Sleeping Beauty by the time it wrapped up production.
Very weird to think about, considering
Yeah.
like this movie. I mean, you and I were kind of talking, and we can get a bit more into this. I think this is one of the most stunning animated movies ever made, perhaps. It is so weird to think that yeah, he was not happy with it because it's gorgeous, it's incredible, it's a masterpiece, I would say.
Right. And, you know, we've said before that, like, if we do another Disney season, it'll probably be specifically, like, the Walt Disney Animation filmography, which, if you're unaware, basically, the big major productions made by Walt Disney Animation are part of, like, a sort of canon. There's, I believe, 61 movies as of a recording, 62 with Wish. So it's, like, pretty much, like, from Snow White to the upcoming Wish, which I think is opening, like, the
Right.
week we're putting this episode out, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
Right. So those are the official kind of like big ones. How do you feel about especially like the Walt era of this? So like from like Jungle Book like prior all the way, because we've talked about this many times about like our sort of different rankings of the Walt Disney Animation canon and stuff like that. How do you feel about this specific era when Walt was around for those films?
Well, it's very interesting, I think, for me because I didn't really grow up with like the early Disney movies at all. I mainly grew up just watching like the Renaissance movies
Right.
and then the 2000s movies, of course. It wasn't until I think I was like in high school that I had watched like any of these older movies like Pinocchio or Dumbo or Bambi. And I think mainly now I look back at them and it's a very mixed bag for me, I think, because I really love some of them. In particular, like I rewatched Alice in Wonderland for this episode and Fantasia, and I love like Dumbo, but like I've never had an emotional connection to Bambi. Maybe I'm just like a monster, but like it's never been a movie that like I've really like had an emotional attachment to. But the animation side of things, I've become, I think, more interested in these movies because like I mean, this old school animation is just so Disney now doesn't make 2D animation, and it I miss it. I think I like some of these movies, and we can get into specifics of like which ones you know, we each prefer. But yeah, I don't have like fond nostalgic memories for it. It's more something I've discovered more as I've gotten older, I think. But yeah, what about you? Do you have like a history with the early Disney movies at all? Did you watch them as a kid?
I would say so, yeah, because I think just to show a bit more of our like age difference. I don't know if you have this as much, but like the clamshell VHSs were very crucial,
I had the Lion King one, I think.
right?
It was that one or Aladdin. I think it was only those two I had.
Yeah, because I mean, I remember I have very fond memories of, admittedly, like, I grew up with some of these, like, all together as one package. I could tell that some of them felt different. I didn't really know that, like, oh, one was, like, from 1940 versus one from, like, 1992 or whatever. But, like, I grew up with, like, a mixture of, like, the Renaissance era and some of these older classics. I'd say particularly, the biggest one is Pinocchio, if only because I have a weird thing where my grandmother had a massive Pinocchio collection. Not just Disney Pinocchio, but like any sort of different Pinocchio like figure or snow globe or like anything like that. I have, in fact, this little holographic Pinocchio thing that was like from
This is
my
Pinocchio and Geppetto,
right.
and the cat.
It might not translate to the zoom camera, but it like is holographic, so it moves.
Oh, okay, right.
Yes. So that's one of the things from her collection. I grew up very much with that movie in particular. And I still think that's probably my favorite of like that era. Nothing else because that movie's like deranged. That movie's like a stream conscious nightmare.
It is, and that is kind of like the thing I like about a lot of these early Disney movies is how like kind of dark they are.
Yeah.
And like, you know, as obviously like that goes in with the fairy tales thing where those fairy tales are dark. But that is kind of the thing about it that I think attracts me to them more now is kind of just those really kind of weird, fucked up elements to it, which I just really love.
Yeah, because I mean, I think I would say like Pinocchio, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, 101 Dalmatians, Peter Pan, and another movie I'm going to talk about in a bit. Those were like the ones I remember, like this particular era that I watched a lot when I was younger. Mm-hmm. You know, I did revisit some of these, a couple years ago and also in the last couple days for this particular episode. And it is curious, especially, there's some stuff that doesn't hold up about maybe some of those movies.
What?
I
don't know.
I don't know. I just finished Dumbo and I have a few notes. I'll say. I have
yeah.
a few notes about some characters who show up. And I mean, and there's also there's just a bunch of other things like the package films, which is like kind of key to like sort of the history of Disney animation, where like with Sleeping Beauty, it had come off of like, the big success of Snow White, the failure kind of Pinocchio and Fantasia, then rebounding with like Dumbo and Bambi, then the package films era, which if you don't know, basically in the 40s because of World War II, after like between Bambi and Cinderella, it was just all these like movies that are like segments, like anthology films, where like they're like Saludos Amigos, the ones with Donald Duck and the other two birds. And just some other ones that have been completely lost to time were very much like prevalent because they were a lot more cost effective. And then Walt kind of went back into it with like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and Lady and the Tramp, which were all big successes, leading up to our movie, which let's just play the trailer here now for Sleeping Beauty.
Sleeping Beauty. Sparkling with colorful spectacle, brimming with gay music and delightful new songs, filled with fascinating new Disney characters.
I wonder.
You'll meet lovely Princess Briar Rose.
I wonder why each little bird has a someone.
You'll meet the most delightful fairies who ever wafted a magic wand. Flora.
Follow me.
Fauna, and Merryweather. And you'll see Maleficent work her wondrous witchcraft.
Stand back, you fools!
The fine art of animation becomes magnificent entertainment as Walt Disney brings one of the world's favorite stories to the screen. The management of this theater is proud to recommend this magnificent motion picture to every member of every family everywhere.
So, Sleeping Beauty came out in 1959, specifically January 29th, 1959. These January, dump month releases.
Weird January movie. I can't imagine like it being January, being like, all right, let's go see a elegant animated Disney movie.
Well, that's the thing, is that this one coming out in 1959 was not originally the plan. Because basically, this is the 16th feature from Walt Disney Animation. Interesting fact, sandwiched between Lady and the Tramp and 101 Dalmatians. So, 2 dog movies. Success with the dog movie, kind of disappointing with the non-dog movie. And then, fuck, we gotta go back to dogs. 101 of them. Bring them in.
Yeah. I don't think there's any dogs in this movie, right?
I don't think so, no.
I don't think
recall.
there are.
No dogs. There's plenty of other animal sidekicks.
That's true. There's a bird.
Couple birds.
That's true.
Yeah, so this feels definitely like very odd in the middle of that. And
It does.
even in general with like most of the other Disney movies, because that's sort of like the big factor of this one, is that Walt's wanted to do a version of Sleeping Beauty ever since like 1938, apparently. He was like curious about doing something based on that particular fairy tale. So then it, for a while, kind of languished until eventually around 1950 when Cinderella came out and was a big success.
Right.
Well, it was like, I want to do another sort of fairy tale story like that, but I want to make sure it's different. I don't want it to be just like the exact same thing as Cinderella, which, to be fair, I'm kind of for, because despite growing up with that movie a lot, that one doesn't hold up as well to me necessarily.
Look, here's my confession with Cinderella. As much as I like a lot of aspects of that movie, I really disliked the mice in that movie.
Gus, not a fan.
Yeah, they're all so annoying. I like that a lot of the movie is like them just like fucking around, trying to avoid the cat, right? That's fun.
Right.
But it's just so much of that, and I can't deal with their voices. Yeah, it's not one of my favorite ones, Cinderella, necessarily.
No, beautiful sequences, but it feels definitely more like
Yeah.
when somebody is talking about a Disney movie for all like its very typical, sort of elements. Cinderella's kind of like the poster child. It's like the big sort of crowd pleaser version of like a Disney princess movie, especially of that time. But yeah, so he wanted to do something very different, and you can tell with Sleeping Beauty, because I remember this one is one I definitely did watch at some point as a kid, but it wasn't one that I immediately like loved as a kid. It was one I watched like maybe a couple times, but I was just like, no, this is never like my particular thing. And honestly, I think that's just because, unlike a Cinderella, which has like a lot more goofy, cartoonish, like sort of side characters and like some of the more familiar Disney songs, Sleeping Beauty feels very different by comparison. It's a very like, it almost feels like you're looking at a tapestry
Yes.
come to life.
Yeah, and especially like that opening with like all the guards and everything, like just I don't know, just the style of it feels so different than Cinderella, and does feel like you said like a tapestry. It is just so elegant and extravagant.
Yeah, to the degree that it was actually directly inspired by the unicorn tapestries, which are over at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. John Hench, one of the big animators, just like, let's do something based on this. And I like that aesthetic a lot more, like, the older I've gotten. Every time I revisit this movie since I was a kid, I've gotten a lot more endeared to it, I think, because it does truly feel like you're just watching a piece of art come to life in a way that, like,
Right.
the other, obviously, there's art to all the other Disney movies of this era, but they all look like these are very, like, incredibly accomplished cartoons, versus this is, like, a painting that somehow has gained sentience.
Yeah, and especially like I did this thing a couple years ago where I watched all 60 whatever Disney animated movies in a row, and getting to this one, you do feel this like really big change in like in the style, right? Like yeah, they as much as I love the animation style of those early movies, they feel like cartoons, right? Like they feel like what you imagine early animation of this time to look like. And yeah, I mean, just the way that everything in this movie looks. Like, I could talk about all of the objects in this movie, like just the trees. I mean, just the trees in this movie look incredible.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that, from at least my research, which admittedly I'm throwing out random tidbits I have in the notes here. There's so much about any individual goddamn Disney movie, particularly this one. I would actually recommend, we're on Talk Film Society. I would recommend the Dream a Little Deeper podcast, which is one of our sister shows. That basically is like every single episode is going in depth about each of the Walt Disney animated movies. And they have a great episode about Sleeping Beauty. I'd recommend listening to that. I'm going to probably curb a fair amount of things from that. But yeah, it feels definitely like Walt wanted to put so much into this one, because one of the stronger traits about Walt Disney was how much he really wanted to innovate with animation. And you can tell, like, at this particular point, after especially being, like, hogtied to, like, we gotta keep doing fucking package films for, like, a decade, he's like, okay, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to experiment, do some big things. Like, this is one of the early animated films that's, like, had the soundtrack recorded in, like, stereo, for example. Also, it was shot with, like, an interesting, weird 70mm version of animation. Like, I've heard screenings of, like, this over at, like, MoMA and stuff like that for the big, like, 70mm version. And you can tell, like, it looks so wide. It looks like you're watching, like, sort of a stereoscope, which didn't exist for animation at the time.
Right, yeah, I mean, you know me, I love aspect ratios, and it's in, like, it's wider than typical, like, widescreen. It's 255. It's
Right.
so wide, and, like, just so, it looks so great. And all, like, especially early on, the scenes in, like, in the castle, just how much, like, stuff you can see, like, just horizontally is so, it just looks so incredible and so striking.
To the degree that, like, apparently that was a big problem with, like, the animators. Like, this is the one that most of, like, the 9 old men, who, if you don't know, are, like, the main 9 animators that worked with Walt from, like, the beginning until, like, Fox and the Hound, pretty much. Like, after Walt had died. They were, like, they retired around that point. But they kept talking about how, like, this was the hardest one to possibly animate, because, obviously, when you look at it, like, these characters are much more stiff than traditional, like, other Disney movies, and kind of have more of this distinctive style that we're referring to. And a lot of them said, like, we had to, like, animate on, like, paper that was even, like, bigger than we were used to. We had to fill up a frame of literal, like, goddamn paper for, like, every individual bit of this movie. So it feels as if, like, a lot of that, like, blood, sweat, and tears comes through in the movie, even if, like, a lot of the animators, like I said at the time, like, Mark Davis, who's one of the great Disney animators, one of the 9 old men, who was the main animator on both Aurora and Maleficent, had a lot of struggles with animating Maleficent in particular, because it's like, she doesn't interact with anybody, really, aside from, like, the Raven and her minions. It's a lot of scenes of her, like, kind of pontificating and speechifying on her own. He's like, I don't know what the fuck to do with this, Walt. This lady barely moves. She has, like, I can move her hands and, like, her facial expressions, but she's a very tall, like, covered in this, like, giant draping cloak character that I can't animate a lot with, like, flexibility.
When she shows up in the movie, however, you're like, it's such a striking character design, and her entrance is so iconic and everything. Just throughout, every time we get just her and her, like, layer, I'm just like, she looks so cool. Like, just a really incredible character design, and, like, we'll get to maybe the coolest segment in any animated movie when she becomes the dragon. Yeah, I just think she's such an incredible character design.
Those limitations for, like, a Mark Davis really allow him to pull out a lot more, like, okay, what can we do, like, with her facial expressions? What can we do with, like, her hand movements? The way she talks with her hands is, like, really well done. And even just, like, her interacting with that Raven, who also isn't, like, a funny animal sidekick. Like, the closest we get to that is, like, Sleeping Beauty's little animals that come out, and they aren't even, like, that cartoony in the grand spectrum of, like, Disney animated sidekicks, animal sidekicks. And I think the Raven is just a great example. Like, there's that bit where she's talking to him about, like, oh, these minions are an embarrassment to me, the mistress of evil. And the Raven looks, like, very forlorn in a believable way. Like, she's like, oh, mom's upset. It's a bummer that mom's upset.
The bird has great animation, and, like, as a character. And, like, I love, like, the shot when, it's the shot when he finds out that Aurora is in the woods, and it like, peeks through the door. And just, like, such a funny way that it peeks through the door, where I'm just, I don't know, it gets me every time.
But at the same time, it's not also extremely cartoony animation, despite the fact that we're talking about, like, this bird evil villain sidekick. Like, there's a version of this movie where that character acts a lot more like bugs out his eyes, like, what? It's
Aladdin,
right.
It's,
of course, yeah. Where it's like
yeah.
Gilbert Gottfried, R.I.P. Oh my God, she's sleeping over there. I can't believe it. Look at her sleeping on the job. It's a bad Gilbert Gottfried, but
oh man, yeah, but, like, there is no characters like that in this, and it's what's so interesting about this movie is that, like, this movie has kind of a regal quality to it.
Yeah, truly medieval as well. I think that the art style helps with that, because it feels like you're looking at, oh, this was a tapestry discovered in, like, 85 England or whatever,
Yeah.
a castle.
It feels like a fairy tale come to life more in the way that Cinderella does, because Cinderella just is a bit goofier, but I think like doesn't really, I don't know, they're different movies, but like I do love the way that this movie is not serious though. Like I love the three what are they, like what would you call them?
The fairy
Like,
godmothers.
Fairy godmothers, okay, yeah. The three fairy godmothers are like so fun and so like charming and like funny to watch together, and yet this movie isn't like too funny in the way that some Disney movies can be, if that makes any sense.
No, I agree with you, but at the same time, like, this movie delivers some of the weird, like, few subtle bits of humor. Like, I think maybe my favorite line of the whole movie is, I believe it's Flora, Verna Felton, who's one of the great Disney voice actresses, who's like, she's in Dumbo, she's the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland.
Okay.
And here she
Yep,
plays, like,
okay.
the red one.
Right.
And that bit where she's putting the dress on Merryweather, the blue one. And she's like, oh, this dress looks ugly. Oh, it's only because it's on you, dear. It's like such a great, such a subtle burn. And then they just like fly away from it immediately.
Yeah, there's so many little moments like that I love. And just with them as well. And like not even just like a moment I love is when, is it Fauna? Is she not the blue one, not the red one, the green one?
Yeah.
The way that she, like, when she's baking the cake is like 2 eggs folded in and like fold them in and you hear the crack. It's just so many great little moments like that I love in this movie.
Yeah, and I think like, those three are very crucial because like those characters in any other Disney movie would be very much like side characters who would have their own like little subplot going on, as opposed to really, I think a thing that I've heard a lot of people complain about with Sleeping Beauty is like, well, Sleeping Beauty and Prince Charming aren't really that like developed as main characters, and I agree, but also one, I think that's the case with a lot of these characters. Maybe I don't know, maybe they're very archetypal, a princess and a Prince Charming. Shockingly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But two, more importantly, the movie I don't think really dwells on them that much. It feels almost like we mentioned, like Walt had already done sort of like the Cinderella like example with like her and her prince, who's far more, I would argue, like a trifle of a person, even compared to like Prince Philip here. But what I like is that they have them sort of being like, you're the catalyst, you're our MacGuffin ostensibly for this movie.
Right.
While at the same time making her like a fun Disney princess, I think, in her own right. This young girl who was raised by like 3 old weirdo ladies in the middle of the woods, as far as she knows. And I think it adds kind of to her weird personality. It feels like she's very independent. Like, they're kind of goofy and being weird. I had to kind of raise myself, basically, to a certain degree, but I love them at the same time. I kind of like that dynamic that she has. And I think that's what makes this much more interesting is like, she's going on with like the prince, doing the Once Upon a Dream stuff, but really the main focus is on these 3 fairies trying to make sure that like their adopted daughter doesn't get kidnapped by an evil sorceress lady.
Oh, right. Like, this is what's so interesting about this movie is that it's called Sleeping Beauty.
Yes.
And yet, like, I would say these 3, the fairy godmothers, are the protagonists of the movie, basically. Like, all of the movie is kind of handled through their perspective, and like it's.
So it should have been called 3 Fairies and a Baby, basically.
It should have been called 3 Fairies and a Baby. Yeah, I mean, look, we're not bringing up new ideas here of like, maybe these old Disney movies had not the best representations of women or, of really any character of any of these kind of stuff.
Though by contrast, great representation for people of color, clearly, right? In those, like, nothing problematic or horrible whatsoever. Any of those old movies?
Yeah, how many of those Disney Plus disclaimers did you see?
Oh, I saw quite a few of them. Though Sleeping Beauty avoids that, I think, mainly because it's less cartoony. Because cartoony in the Walt era sadly often meant very bad stereotypes that we can very much exaggerate in a cartoonish fashion.
Yes, which is one of the many reasons I do not like the movie Peter Pan, because it dwells on that.
Oh, is there some bad stuff in there? Is there some bad... Is there some stuff in there maybe about Tiger Lily and her people?
Oh, yeah. So much of like the way that I view this movie, and I find so much of like that kind of way that people view movies of like, how do they fall in love in one scene, whatever, all this stuff. It's like, I in my view, I sort of view it as like fairy tale logic. You know, like when you're reading a fairy tale, you're not. It is sort of that imaginative sort of realm that you're kind of operating in, where you're just like, I know this isn't real. This is a fairy tale. This is a heightened version of reality or what have you in the story. And I think that's how I view like this movie with her. But I do love like just her scene when she's in the woods, just like frolicking around. I think that like her and the animals are so funny. Like I love when the owl like steals the hat and the coat and like dances with her. I find that so sweet.
Well,
And
to be fair, it's not just him. He's not doing the lion's share of that work, because there's that squirrel underneath the hat.
sure,
There's
that's
the two
true.
birds
That's
holding
true.
up that cape,
The two birds are important.
and
That's
then the
true.
two bunnies in the boots, which I love. That's my favorite detail. And they're very good at dancing, despite the fact that they're just hopping inside two shoes.
They are. But I love this whole entire section. It feels just so nice and sweet and like just, but also just feels like some like, I don't know, the animation in this section of like the backgrounds, which are just so stunning with like the foliage that's there. I talked about like the trees earlier, but like literally there's 5 different kinds of trees in this movie where I was just like, look at that tree. It looks so good. I could stare at it for like an hour.
Well, particularly, there's that one shot where Sleeping Beauty is almost like a precursor to like that one shot in the Hakuna Matata montage in Lion King, where she's like walking on the log with the animals, and then we like zoom underneath and we zoom all the way into the prince. Like that is an amazing shot, especially considering for like the time. Where one of my earliest memories of like behind the scenes stuff is as a little kid, like at the end of these VHSs, there would usually be like a little featurette about just like how this was made, and there's a lot of like sort of the live action reference stuff, which was a thing with Sleeping Beauty, but also in particular that whole like, I don't know what it's called, maybe it's like Vistaglide, whatever it is, where it's like 9 layers of glass that have different like background elements together,
I know what you're
and
talking
then you
about.
like zoom through it, like, which happens a lot in these like earlier Disney movies. Just like their signature basically is just like that fucking shot. And in this case, it's like with 2 moving characters in 2 different background settings, and like to the degree that I found out this whole sequence, where like everything from when she's like walking around outside to the end of like the Once Upon a Dream thing took 2 years to animate.
Jesus Christ. I've seen footage of like them making these early Disney movies a lot, but like and animation in general, just I don't understand how it's done. And like I can watch all these behind the scenes stuff. I've seen the Miyazaki documentaries many times, and I'm just like, it makes no sense. It might as well be magic to me, the way the animation is done. It's so stunning, and especially this movie in particular. And like you mentioned that earlier section when like it zooms into Prince Philip, like that's when like the widescreen just looks so great, and all these woodland set scenes as well, like just look so great because you're getting just so much of like of the environment that like you really just like soak in this setting, which I love. I just love the aesthetic of like just the way the woods look and how like big and mysterious they are, and again all the trees and everything. It's so great.
Yeah, and with all that said, I think a big part of all this, obviously, like I mentioned, Walt, when he started doing this movie, was very adamant about like wanting to do like such different concepts of what like an animated movie could kind of be around this time. And I think that like longer production period that we're talking about, where like this weird, like there's so much stuff. Like one of the original directors, I forgot the man's name, but he had like a heart attack early into the production of this movie, so they had to like, because we didn't say who the director of this movie is, because there's 4 of them, and not all of them stuck around for the entire time. Clyde Giromini, Wolfgang Reitherman, and Wolfgang Reitherman I knew because he's like one of the 9 old men, and he'd been around for quite a bit. Eric Larson and Les Clark. And we should also mention, of course, like with any animated movie, particularly of this era, there's story by credits, but the whole thing with like the animation process, this is also still the case, I think, with like some like TV shows and stuff like that. But basically, an outline is written for an animated movie, and then individual animators kind of create the connecting material, particularly during the storyboarding process, where certain animators are like, here you like design like this from point A to B with like a little comic strip thing, basically showing up all like the big shots and actions and stuff like that. And this movie feels very much like, you know, with some of the other Disney movies, you can kind of feel like, oh, this is like this particular animator's style, this particular thing, like particularly with these 9 old men, like that's Frank Thomas's style, or that's Ollie Johnson's style, etc. and so forth. This is a rare example where like all of the characters feel kind of a piece with this world. Even the most slapsticky character, which I just want to shout out, that Jester dude is the best.
It's
like
my
that
boy.
whole the Scrumps thing is so good with like the two kings like getting drunk, and that Jester just like drinking as much as he can. Like it's the most slapsticky stuff, but like it fits very well in this world despite it being like the most silly stuff.
Yeah, and that scene really does kind of come out of nowhere if you're not really like, every time I watch it I'm like, oh right, there's a scene where the two kings like kind of drunkenly fake fight, and I just, every time he grabs the fish and tries to kill him with the fish with like a sword, it just really gets to me.
One of my favorite details, by the way, one of the funnier bits is him like realizing like, oh, this is silly, I'm not gonna do that, but he still takes the fish that he was holding like a sword and then sheaths it in his
He
belt.
holsters it. Oh, save that for later.
Shout out, Bill Thompson is the voice of King Hubert. I love it. Another one of those
So
great like
great.
Disney guys, just the bumbling dad archetype.
Maybe my favorite archetype in any of these movies, I think. Like, it's becoming that just because I just think it's so funny. I love, like, when they're talking later and, like, it's when Prince Philip is like, you know, it is the 14th century, which I love. But, like,
Right.
but when he's like, you know, yes, father, I should do whatever I want and go marry that girl. Goodbye. And then he says, oh, yes, goodbye, father. Oh, wait. And, like, it's just so great. The rhythm of like all the dialogue scenes is so of its time, right? Like it's just so weird and like fast and just like snappy.
Feels kind of screwballish, which is like something like the Disney movies tend to be a bit more like obviously cartoony, like we mentioned, but this feels more like a screwball almost thing, of
Right.
just like a farce with like the kings in particular, which is like they're very much in the dark. These kings who, by the way, one of them was just like, oh, my baby, to protect her, 3 ladies who are like in my company will raise her away from me. And I do love that bit early on, though, the baby shower bit where the young Prince Philip sees her in the cradle and she's like, who he will be betrothed to, and he's like, oh, really?
Right. And that's one of those like things where like yeah, you're watching and you're like, oh, that's kind of weird, and then yeah, he makes a great, like, from an animation perspective, what a great like face that he makes. And I mean that whole sequence is really incredible. I just love the way that it's structured and like how Maleficent comes in, and you know the whole like but she can do one more wish that will like I forget the thing she says of like instead of dying she'll fall into a slumber, true love's
I
first
have a
kiss,
gift
etc.
for the child.
Yes.
Like I want to shout her out now. Eleanor Audley, the voice of Maleficent, who was also the voice of Lady Tremaine, aka the evil stepmother in Cinderella. Which she has that perfect kind of like that time of that regality to her performance. Like the bit even in that scene where like someone says like you should not give a gift to my daughter or whatever, and she's like, oh, what an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, and I love the way like she shows up and everyone's like, oh, not Maleficent. Like I just love the idea that like she's the witch and she lives here. We all like tolerate her and we know she lives around here, but we just don't want her to show up.
Every town has this. It's kind of like the town drunk. Like, we know that she's here. It's kind of awkward.
Right. Yeah, and just the way she enters of like the lightning strikes and then she just like appears. It's so great.
It's a wonderful like motivation. I love for, because obviously with so many of these other like Disney villain characters, like they don't have like much of a motivation beyond evil necessarily. I just love the fact that she's just really upset. Like, you guys are having a big fucking party where like the whole kingdom's here. Like even the blacksmith down there is here. He never goes to anything, but you're inviting him and you didn't invite me? All right, fuck all of you. Fuck you all. This kid is gonna get killed by a spinning wheel in like 16 years.
Yeah, it's great, and it's menacing and like horrifying, and yet it's like again, like her design is so cool. I love all like the smoke when she's like I guess teleporting away, like all the smoke effects and everything are so cool. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of tell with her in contrast like some of the other characters. A big interesting thing about this movie is because of like all the stuff I'm talking about where like Disney was like so invested in it and like making this big grander like production, almost felt like a Disney's Folly kind of thing, quote unquote, around the time. You kind of get the sense this is like the end of an era for animation, but you can see some of the transitional points. Like a big thing, a couple of animators that got their start on this movie. One, Don Bluth, who would later, of course, go on to do like an American Tail and stuff like that, got his early start doing stuff for this movie, as well as a guy named Floyd Norman, very beloved in the Disney circles because he was one of the first examples of like a long-time employee of Disney who was an animator who was black.
Very cool.
Working on here, and he talked a lot about sort of like those issues with like a painting on a large canvas I was talking about earlier and stuff like that. And someone who I had no idea about, that was very fascinating to hear, Chuck Jones of Looney Tunes briefly worked on this movie.
Okay.
Because basically, I loved hearing, apparently the explanation was basically, around this time, Warner Brothers was like, oh, you know what's the big thing that's going to move the future of cinema? 3D movies. We're going to put all our chips into 3D movies, but we have to make cuts. So you know what? Animation department, gone. You're gone. You're out of here. Chuck, you don't have a job anymore. So he's like, crap. All right, where else can I go? I guess Disney? I guess I'll go over there.
Right.
And apparently the whole thing was because of the different production turmoils going on in this movie. He was there for 4 months in 1953. So like when this movie's in deep, like weird story development, he was just apparently sitting around at his office waiting for some kind of thing to do. The rumor is the only thing he kind of worked on is he maybe designed the minions for Maleficent, which kind of makes sense. They're a bit more cartoony. They feel like they would be not uncommon like a Bugs Bunny short, potentially. But apparently, like within 4 months, Warner Brothers was like, Chuck, we really regret doing the 3D like all in. It's not going to work out. We're going to bring back the Looney Tunes and we're going to hire you and your animators back at your salary. He's like, fuck you, Disney. I'm out. I'm going back to WB.
God, that's so funny to think that they sent that the late night, like, you up text. Like, I miss you.
Bugs Bunny emojis. Which I think is like a big thing. You can kind of see this feels like we're kind of transitioning out of like that classic Disney animation, because I think by the time you get to like 101 Dalmatians, we're in full Xerox territory.
Xerox, baby.
Right. The rough pencil sketchy kind of animation that Don Bluth obviously would become famous for. You see a lot more of his imprints like on that particular movie. And obviously like just because Disney needed to like cut back on costs at this point, because he was so invested in like, oh, I got my theme parks and I've got my TV and I've got, I guess, a Sleeping Beauty movie that I abandoned that ended up flopping hard. So yeah, this feels very much like an end of an era kind of movie.
It does, yeah, and especially like, it's weird to think that like, you know, watching this movie, you're just like, oh my god, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. Did they ever make any other ones that look like this? And the next movie, 101 Dalmatians, is like polar opposite, right? It would like, I don't know, it's like a band hiring like an orchestra and then making like a lo-fi like home recorded album or whatever.
I mean, and I find some charm in that Xerox era. I think there's a charm, a scrappiness to those movies. To some
100%. And
yeah, 101% maybe.
God. Yeah, but like I really like the Xerox style in like 101 Dalmatians and like in stuff like the Jungle Book and that. But like it really is like as it goes on into like the late 70s and 80s that style really starts to look like ugly, where I think early on it looks very like unique and like, oh, this is a new kind of style that they're doing.
I would argue my favorite of that kind of style though is post Walt dying with Robin Hood. I think because that one feels a lot more madcap and a lot more kind of just like, this is a very scrappy adventure where everybody's like barely like holding together.
You know, I've only seen that movie like once. When I did my whole Disney run through, I should watch it again. It
feels like weirdly the Disney hangout movie.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean that sort of animation style, which like I would say my favorite of kind of that maybe is 101 Dalmatians, because I think like I don't know, something about it in that movie in particular really like it really kind of meshes together for me, like just everything about it.
Well, I mean, you can just see it in the distinct ways, like on paper, say like Maleficent and Cruella de Vil, the villain of that movie. There's a lot of similarities you can tell in the design. Mark Davis did animate Cruella de Vil as well. But you can tell he is having a lot more fun with doing Cruella de Vil because it's much more like a silly character going around like her cigarette prop, darling, and all this other stuff.
In the bed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, and with the big coat as well, contrasted with like her very skinny frame that's underneath it and stuff like that. You can tell there's a bit more of like, that's more of a cartoonish kind of villain. Like she literally wants to kill puppies. That's like her whole motivation for like a coat. As opposed to like Maleficent, despite feeling, you know, much more of like evil, she has horns and shit, she's demonic to some degree. At the same time, feels a bit more like subtle and nuanced, which is weird to say about, like I said, a lady who turns into a fucking dragon by the end of this movie.
Well, right. Yeah, and when she has a line that like makes me like do the Marvel reaction of like, yeah, just cheering when she says, "Now you shall deal with me, O Prince, and all the powers of hell."
Yeah.
Just so fucking cool. Oh, man. Yeah, but, like, yeah, that style, the difference is very interesting, I think, because Maleficent does feel like a very regal type of, like, villain in this movie, whereas Cruella, like, is always smoking, and is, like when she's smoking, it's, like, a green, like, gas, too, or, like, a smoke, so, like, yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see the contrast between, like, this movie and 101 Dalmatians, I think.
Yeah. I think you can tell also with this one, like a big difference in it, I think, is we should credit the music. This is a musical, like many of the Disney animated films at the time, but notably it's not like, I don't know, around this time they would have gotten somebody like Oliver Wallace or one of those other like older, much more kind of classic Disney composers. This versus a guy named George Bruns, who had been a musician, but this is his first composing job. And he was mainly put on after, to be fair, they had a bunch of different composers come on. This was originally going to be a lot more of like a 50s Broadway kind of score. Walt was just like, this doesn't quite fit. Versus they literally take from the Tchaikovsky Sleeping Beauty ballet. And put lyrics onto those songs. And I think that's such an interesting choice, particularly for Disney to like adapt so specifically from existing music. But at the same time, when I was younger, I never was aware of that. So when I found out that like that was a previous used score, I'm like, I don't know, it still feels like Disney to me.
Yeah, same. I just always associated that music with this movie. It's kind of one of these weird things where like, even though I didn't see this movie growing up, I think I knew Once Upon a Dream, like just from some like just Disney, like, you know. I love Once Upon a Dream, by the way, while we're on the music. I think that song is so great and really beautiful. That section when they like dance, and it's weird with these early Disney movies because I don't love a lot of the songs in these early ones, but I really love that one. And I'm curious, do you like the kind of early Disney stuff? Because had they done music, or had they done like musical stuff before? I'm trying to remember.
I mean, yeah, all of them, like Cinderella had been musical. There, like a lot of these had been musicals prior.
Because like Cinderella has like one song, doesn't it?
No, it has a couple songs. I mean, they're not as memorable.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, a lot of these had like multiple musical numbers. They were still like musicals at the time. But I think the big thing that separates with this one is like there's only one big musical number. A lot of the other songs in this are kind of like groups or like the Disney chorus, which is something I really loved as a kid. When like I associate this movie so much with like weird choral Disney singers could only like exist in like an era pre-digital recording, like just that particular style, like a chorus, just feels very much indicative of like these movies to me. And while in a lot of the other movies it's kind of like the title track, like the Peter Pan, like Second Star to the Right, stuff like that over the credits, this movie does that a lot more than I think the average one. They have a bit in the opening credits of this, and there's also like the Hail to the Princess. It's like a big chorus thing. There's no specific character singing that. The only songs where people like sing with each other really are like Once Upon a Dream and Scrumps, which is the one I think original song I believe in the movie, which is great drinking song. I'm gonna bring that up to the boys next time we go to the bar. Scrumps, everybody. But But I think that helps for this movie because it almost feels like this isn't as like specifically musically driven as much as it feels like it's part of like a ballet. Like it feels more like, say, Peter and the Wolf, where it's just like there are themes for certain characters, but there's not as much of like singing directly.
It feels like there's more music in the background and music as like a score rather than music than people singing to each other. Like it feels like that is kind of, they do the Once Upon a Dream and that's kind of like almost like the centerpiece of the movie almost, right? Like it's kind of towards the middle of the film. But yeah, I mean the music is so gorgeous, and yet like I still kind of find a bit of charm in the Disney like chorus vocals. They feel very of their time, but I don't know. I kind of like them.
Yeah, and I think also with Once Upon a Dream, what kind of works about it as well is that it's like the actual staging of it is not as much like of a traditional like Broadway, like the two lovers like sing with each other the whole time. It's a solo, and then it becomes a duet just because like she gets caught basically her doing something in public she would be doing like in her bedroom. Like singing a song about like a dream man who I met, and I'm dancing with this owl in a cape because it's just like, this is my fantasy. And then I love that shot where like she's turned around and she still thinks the owl's behind her, and then the prince comes up.
Yeah.
And she's just like, gets surprised as he like starts singing with her and stuff like that. I think it's a great example where like it feels almost like an embarrassing impromptu thing. Like, oh, no, you're not supposed to see this like very private moment.
I also just love like when she's talking to the animals of like, I met this boy and he's this and he's that. And then like, I love the kind of like the disappointed look on the animals is so funny to me when she says, and then I wake up, and it just, I don't know. There's something quite like sweet and just innocent and very like gentle about this whole sequence really, but her kind of talking to the animals, I just still find so charming, even though that's such a Disney thing, right? Like, I mean, Shrek copied so much of like what this movie does still, but like I still think it's so charming and funny.
Yeah, I think a big part of that also shout out Mary Costa, who was the voice actress, both speaking and singing for Aurora, and Bill Shirley, who were both experienced singers. Mary Costa was an opera singer who came from the South, so she had to like cover up her Southern accent with this mid-Atlantic kind of thing she's doing.
Oh, okay.
Which I would never know based on this movie.
I mean, yeah.
Right, and Bill Shirley was like a pop singer who apparently all the girls had crushes on Bill Shirley. A man's man, truly. Bill Shirley. But yeah, I think a big part of that also with like Aurora is that she's the first Disney princess I would argue that feels more modern, I would say. Because like with a lot of the earlier princesses, like Snow White is very much like, this is a 1937 movie, sort of protagonist character. And even Cinderella, I would argue, because they all feel much more like, oh, we are the most good possible people in this world, and these villains are trying to snuff out our good, versus Aurora kind of feels a bit more like a modern teenager, especially like the 50s era. We're kind of getting the rise of the teenager. She feels a bit more like, oh, I have fantasies about my man, and I'm kind of going around my bumbling aunts who aren't as aware of like, well, I'm just going to go outside, I guess, and pick berries, which is I just picked them yesterday. Well, pick some more. We need way more. Kind of bit, but she has like a bit more of a modern sensibility that I think works for her and makes her feel a bit more distinctive from the other princesses of this era.
I agree. Yeah, and I mean, like, I would say she still falls in line with Snow White and Cinderella in that, like, they're a bit passive, I guess, in the story in some ways.
Are you saying the lady who spends the last third of this movie sleeping isn't very active in the story?
I was gonna say she doesn't get a lot to do, but she is sleeping for a long portion of the movie. But like, I agree with what you said though, and I think like, as much as that like that joke that they say of like it is the 14th century is kind of like just a really funny joke, I do think it is kind of like this a really funny interesting idea. But also like I've always just liked the idea in this movie that like they meet without knowing that who the other person is, right? There's kind of a screwball comedy thing to that as well. Right. Where he's like, I'm supposed to marry the princess, but he's already met the princess. It's such a great kind of screwball like type of plot.
Yes.
That like, I think even though it is a very fairy tale, Disney kind of like love at first sight, prince and princess kind of love, I think it's still very like, it's very funny and that charming, like especially like the conversation he has with his father is so funny to me.
Well, it also feels a bit subversive for like Walt Disney at the time. I think that's also an interesting aspect of it. And it feels like it's just like the right dashes of it where it's just like kind of a wink, not like an aggressive like nudge in your ribs like some modern Disney movies do. Like I love Moana, but the bits where they do reference like if you're gonna sing, I'm gonna hurl, like stuff like that.
Exactly.
Where it's like all of their sort of basis of like Disney satire is very firmly baked in like the 1990s still. It's like, we're not your average. That's become the cliche now, honestly.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that's the more aggressive version of it, as opposed to here. There's like winking, but it's not like too like much in your face. It feels like Walt knew, just like kind of like that part of what I was talking about, where he was very firmly like, I want to make this a bit different from the average Disney movie. We're a bit more self-aware. We're a bit more lavish and stylish with our designs and stuff like that. But at the same time, yeah, I think it kind of, I don't know, this is, we've talked about the idea of a vibes movie. But I would argue this one kind of fits a bit more in kind of like for the Walt Disney animation era. It feels a bit more like vibesy. Like in the same way of like a Fantasia and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, the woodland kind of stuff is very like, it doesn't, I don't know what season it is, but it's giving, it feels very fall. I mean, just maybe all the like the dead trees and everything, and like it absolutely is. I mean, like just so much of the ambiance of this movie is so great with all like just the castles and like the forest and like, and I mean we'll get to the castle scene later, which is just so my aesthetic.
Yeah. Well, you know, let's talk about Maleficent's lair. Her little her enclave, especially in contrast to the lavish stuff we see of like King Stephen's land, which I love the look of all that. Like you were mentioning the sort of opening setting, like the big hall where everyone's like attending to see the newborn princess. It looks so lavish versus fucking Maleficent's place.
Where does she live? Of the Forbidden Mountain? Is that what it's called?
I believe so. Yeah.
Cool. And I love just the way that they're like, when they have to eventually go there to rescue Philip, they're like, not the Forbidden Mountain, we can't go there. I love anytime there's a place that's like, you know, just this horrible place we can't go, and it looks so great with just all the spiky like mountains everywhere, like so great.
And also I just want to share, I do love her minions. I think they are.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Especially the whole scene where she's talking about just like, so did you search everywhere? Yeah, we searched all the houses and the cradles. And it's like this whole time they've been looking for a baby.
Yeah, I love that. I love when she just like after that when she just goes crazy and starts like throwing spells and like a bunch of them just like fall down the stairs and everything. Like they're not too like. They're not the minions or anything, right? They're not like
there's no Kevin or Bob or Doug to be seen here.
Maybe they should be. but like they do feel kind of like, I love the voice. We checked all the cradles and the like. I love the voice. I love just like the little design of it and how kind of that goes along with kind of just the more gothic and darker side of like these last like 15-20 minutes or so of the movie. Yeah, they're so cool. I love them.
Yeah, which I believe that main one is voiced by a guy named Pinto Clovig, who most might know as he was the original voice of Goofy.
Oh, hell yes.
Right, which makes sense.
I love Goofy.
I would say he kind of has like a goofy sort of tone to him. You know, when she starts using her magic, I was waiting for the Goofy scream to happen.
An extremely goofy tone.
Extremely goofy tone. I wish he would, you know, we're missing rollerblading and skateboarding with those characters. I don't know, if Sleeping Beauty 2 had ever happened like direct to video, that would have probably happened. Thankfully, this was one of the ones spared from that punishment. It did get a live action remake, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
We should
well,
talk
kind
about.
of.
Kind of. It got sort of a subversive take in live action, which we should definitely focus on a little bit later. But yeah, with Sleeping Beauty though, I mean, you know, while we're on this stuff with Maleficent, let's just talk about the dragon thing.
Oh my god, the dragon. Well, just to get it out of the way. One, I love dragons. I love like fantasy and dark fantasy stuff. I love medieval shit, right? I love it. I love the aesthetic. I love just like, you know, all of that stuff. And so just this whole section of like the escape from Maleficent's castle is so striking visually, where like it's so dark, which like the rest of the movie has been very like lively and green, and there's a lot of like life to it, and this feels so like dingy and gothic and dark. But like I love this section because obviously of like just the look of it all, but like I like that again we've been talking about like the three fairy godmothers, and like they are kind of the ones like leading Philip out of this castle, and kind of like they make their way into it and then lead Philip out of it. And I love just all like their little, just the little ways that they like break him out with like the wands. They sound like little like cutters, like zzz.
Or like the bit where like all the rocks are falling down, they turn into bubbles, or like they guard him from like arrows with like a rainbow and stuff like that.
Exactly, yeah. And like I love that they give him the shield and the what is it, the shield of virtue,
right,
and the sword of truth. I love that. Again, just fantasy stuff that I love. Just like, this is a sword and your shield, and go forward on your quest or whatever.
And I just love also that this feels very much like Maleficent and her minions are like pulling out all the last possible stops. Just like, and she's pretty confident all the way until they like start getting past like the trees that are filled with like thorns and stuff like that. That's where she's like, throughout most of that, Maleficent's just like, oh, this will all work, you're fucked, you're dead, you're not getting out of this. And then once that starts happening, she's like, big guns, gotta become the dragon.
Well, she doesn't even like, before she becomes a dragon, she is just kind of like throwing like spells at him at first.
Oh, that great shot of like her on top of her tower, and like the clouds kind of like form around her, and she like throws it. Yeah, that rules.
It's so incredible. And like, yeah, I love when they turn the crow to like a stone crow. I love that, like the way she chases him down. We haven't talked about his horse, who does he have a name? I don't know if he has a name.
I'm not sure. There's plenty of these Disney horses that have names. I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't have the Disney fandom wiki.
I'm sure there's a fandom page for this horse. But I love the animation on the horse. I love how like expressive he is, and he doesn't feel like the horse from like Tangled, for instance, which I like Tangled, to be clear, but like I you know what I mean, like just the difference in kind of like the goofiness of it. Like I love when this is going back a bit, but like when Philip's talking to his dad, and Philip's like, I met this girl, and his dad turns to the horse and is like, is this true? So good.
And the horse has like a couple facial reactions, but yeah, it feels like kind of the precursor to sort of a Tangled in that same way. Where it's like the horse, who normally would just have no personality in these early movies, it just kind of has like a bit of a cartoonish kind of like placement of his eyes and his mouth. Yeah. That get you invested in the horse enough, weirdly, without making him like a full sidekick. Without making him like a Sven in Frozen or some shit.
Right, exactly.
Necessarily. But yeah, I think with these like animal sort of like sidekick characters who do show up, they do feel like, once again, they're kind of tempering that same tonal balance the movie's going through, where it's just like, we're gonna have personality, and we're gonna have like maybe jokes that feel a bit more character animation focused, but not as much like gags, because there was apparently a lot more slapsticky stuff in this movie originally. Like the whole scene where like they make the cake was going to be a lot more like big and elaborate, like, oh, they're like flying out of the chimney and like the whole oven explodes. And Walt was really just like, this feels like a Donald Duck cartoon. Doesn't quite fit this. And fair. And I think that's a big thing with like a lot of these, like even like the three fairy characters do feel like they have like a silliness to them, but at the same time, all the silliness stuff comes from like their individual character bits. With just like, you know, how you have like Flora is like the red one who's a bit more like bossy, and is the one who initially introduces like, we're not going to use magic, we're going to make sure none of that happens so Maleficent can't catch us. And then Fauna, who feels a bit more kind of like flighty and kind of like more just like, oh wow, no, I'll make something work. Like I love the bit with like the most slapstick the cake bit is now is like when she's finished with it, and it's like kind of like a leaning tower of Pisa, like almost falling over like 16 layers, like awkwardly stacked on each other.
The way the candles like individually like slide down.
Yes.
The like broom.
Love that bit. And Merryweather, who's like the shorter one, who's just kind of like, oh, I guess I'll like do something around here. I don't know, nobody like trusts me to do
Why
nothing.
can't we use magic?
Right. She's like that, or she's. I love that like her job after a certain point when they start introducing magic. It's just like, all right, I'm going to make the dress, you're going to get the cake done, and you're going to clean. That's what you do. You get the mop to go.
I love this section though of like them like using magic to do all the stuff, because like I love in any like especially animated movies when like they use magic like this. Like one, I love when they talk to the magic, where they're like, I love when she turns like the book and is like, just do it like it says in here.
Or we're just like, stop, mop, and then the mop like, falls in.
Yes. Yeah, and also I just love like when characters use magic. It's like the broom and like everything and the mop become alive.
Yes.
Right? So like the mop is like walking and everything. I love just like that whole section. I love it is the stuff that feels kind of the most like comedic, the most like slapstick kind of stuff. But I love when the magic makes the cake and it like pours and it looks so like good.
Right.
I want to bite that animated cake. Which
contrasts. So I'm gonna clip that out of context. Like I want to bite an animated cake. He could be talking about Prince Philip at this point. I don't know. Then again, not a lot of cake. No, not quite.
Not true. He's very slender.
Yeah, you gotta wait till, I don't know, which Disney prince has cake. Reply to us in the comments and tell us which Disney prince has the best cake. But which it contrasts really interesting, like all that magic stuff you're talking about. It contrasts very well with like Maleficent, who we kind of steered away from a bit. But like whenever she uses her magic, it's much more kind of ethereal, and it's less of that kind of like personability that like they have with the sentient objects. Like my favorite shot, honestly, of Maleficent that isn't her as a dragon is the whole bit where like they've the three fairies have brought Sleeping Beauty back to the castle, and they put her alone in her room for a bit, and they're gonna like get the king, and then all of a sudden, like the fireplace starts to have some sort of like ethereal kind of like green smoke to it, and then Maleficent just like shows up like silhouetted almost, except for like her eyes piercing through. Is like that feels like something from like the Babadook or some shit. That's like terrifying.
I mean, that whole section where she is like hypnotized by like Maleficent's like calling, I guess, is so like striking. Yeah, I mean that shot of like like you mentioned the hallway is so great. The way like the just the tiny like bit of light comes through and like
where the fireplace especially like opens up just suddenly within like a lighting change into a hallway.
Right. Yeah, and just the kind of like frozen look on her face when she's like walking up to the thing and just hearing Maleficent's voice.
Her hand outstretched, particularly, just like waiting to prick the needle.
It is kind of like going into a bit of a darker kind of like tone of this movie. Like it feels a bit, I don't know. Like I would never say this like a Disney movie has like an edge to it necessarily, but I think it's the closest that like, especially in this era, I feel like they come to without like a lot of like Pleasure Island stuff is like very dark, but that's kind of a different kind of dark, you know what I mean?
This isn't quite as much of like a body horror sequence that involves donkeys necessarily.
Right, just kind of more like the composition of it, the rhythm of it, like everything about it is just like a horror scene almost, or like a thriller scene.
Particularly like the way that the lighting just turns like a dark shade of green. I love that. It just represent like Maleficent is here and her presence is known. I love that. And especially the shot of Sleeping Beauty like on the floor. Because like obviously this happens a lot, like, you know, Snow White did the same thing, which is like Snow White falling over. And that, I mean, that's really, I love that bit in Snow White where like she eats from the apple and then like you just see her arm fall over and like the apple roll out. That's pretty upsetting. But then Walt's just like, okay, how am I going to do it different here? All right, these fairies are going to go up the tower and they're going to find her just lying there, like not even in like a composed state. She's just like flopped on the ground, like she's about to get chalk outlined, basically. She's like, Jesus Christ, a murder just happened here? And Maleficent's just like in the corner, like, yep, fucking did it.
Yep, and then like disappears and like goes and but like, and this is what's so weird about this movie is that like at that point in the plot, their decision is then to put the entire kingdom to sleep while they go solve this. It like such a weird decision, and like I love them putting like everyone to sleep, like the whole kingdom. I love just like it slowly kind of like everyone just like
particularly Hubert asleep. When he's just like trying to tell, just like I talk with my phone. I love that kind of like sleeping mid sentence kind of thing. But yeah, I think that kind of fits with what we were talking about earlier, where like because these fairies and Maleficent are sort of like the major characters, it feels as if like this is more a world where like humans are trifles and magic creatures are really the ones that are like making all of this work. Just like we've been around forever.
Right.
We're aware of like what's going on here far more than you humans. Like we just gotta like put you guys to bed. We gotta treat you like children. Because we gotta get shit done. We're gonna put you to bed, and then we're gonna do adult things over here.
It was always something that I found so striking when I first watched this movie, where I'm like, there's kings, like he's the king and the queen, like how are they putting them to sleep? But I love just that idea of like they're fairy godmothers, okay? They're on a whole other level of like humanity, or like just another level to humans. But yeah, I love it. It's such a weird choice. It's such a like interesting choice, and like I don't know, feels so like, again, feels like a very fairy tale thing that they just like executed really, really well. I think it's great,
especially leading up to like the only human character who has like any kind of agency at this point is the prince, but only because he's like being circled around by these fairies. Just like, we're gonna help you out because like you could not do this on your own. You would die instantly if you would.
Right.
Because I love one of my favorite like Disney villain monologues ever is after Prince Philip is captured, and Maleficent just comes over just like, "Oh, darling, you wanted to go find your princess? Don't worry, I'm gonna let you out, but I'm gonna wait a while. You're gonna sit down here, and you're gonna stew." But the way that she says it, I just love that it's this very like on paper, everything she's saying sounds romantic. She's like, "Oh, you will eventually get out of here and find your beautiful princess and have true love's first kiss," in the animation of like old ass Prince Philip and the horse.
It's so good. It's like, I love it every single time, and it feels like a genuinely horrifying like villain monologue where I'm like, Jesus, this is like evil. Like,
it's truly Maleficent, as it were. Yeah. Because like I love that too, because like it's so much worse than like, "Oh, I'm gonna kill you." It's like, you're gonna live here chained up, and then when you're like so old that you're gonna like die if you breathe too hard, I'm gonna let you go and climb up those stairs and find your princess, motherfucker. That's what's gonna happen now.
Yeah, it's so great. It rolls. And then we have this whole like escape sequence, and then she turns into a giant dragon in like what is maybe one of my favorite sequences in an animated movie. It just looks so striking. And I mean, we were talking about kind of earlier, you said like this feels like the end of an era for Disney animation, and like it really feels like they are just pulling out all the stops. Like everything feels like they're like this escape sequence is so extravagant, even in a different way than the movie has been up until this point. I'm watching it right now and in the background of this, and it's still like so stunning.
Well, especially with like the way that the dragon is animated is so fascinating to me, because it definitely feels like this is like a creature, but truly a fantastical creature. Because just like, in other Disney animated movies where they've had dragons, like your Peach dragons, stuff like that, you would have like these dragons that have a bit more like personality, a bit more like we mentioned, a cartoonish. Just the reluctant dragon, very much the case in his little animated bit in that movie. But the Maleficent dragon feels so much more like just this unknowable creature not of Earth. It feels truly just like this is like some creature that crawled from, the powers of hell, as it were, just like crawled from hell and is now here to like blow this green fire on you.
It is like such a like, and this whole part with like all the thorns and everything, it is like so metal. Like, and especially the design of the dragon is so like metal, is so cool. And feels like a genuinely like horrifying like creation.
And yet still fits within that tapestry aesthetic of the whole movie. Because, like, when you say metal, I think of, like, a Yes album cover that's, like, painted on, like, the side of a guy's van who, like, hangs out a lot at the smoke shops.
Right. I just love, like, the fact that, like, the dragon has the horns like her, right? So it is distinctly, like, Maleficent, right? It has, like, it's basically her character design just, like, superimposed onto, like, a dragon.
It feels like a better version of, I want to preface this by saying I love this movie, but The Little Mermaid has that kind of problem where like Ursula has to just be like big Ursula, like Kaiju Ursula at the end. as opposed to like I don't know, like make her like a full on like evil octopus or like a 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea squid or that kraken, right? Yeah, like have her like a beak or whatever that still has like Ursula tendencies, as opposed to like her but big. Let's go with that. Like I mentioned, like Kaiju Maleficent was at the end of this movie. I just feel like this is weird.
Yeah, that's true.
I love also her death with like the sword. I think is great, which is like he throws the sword and then that shot of like the weirded almost like puddle that's left over of her, and then the sword turns like black. Like that's the last rim. Like the sword of truth becomes like this thing you can't touch now.
Right, yeah.
It's a conduit for all of her magic that's still left over after she's died.
Right, yeah. I love just the shot of like when he throws the sword and like the sword's in her like chest and she like writhes in pain like that. It just looks so like stunning. And again, like I love when she falls into like the cavern and like that like purple smoke that I don't know why, but like every time I watch it, I'm like, that smoke looks so good.
Yeah, and a big thing was like that's obviously like referencing part of her wardrobe with like the black cloak that has like purple lining that we can see. Like if you look at the early concept drawings that Mark Davis did, she had a lot more like sort of red sort of lining on her stuff, but that feels almost like too close to like devil. Instead, like purple adds another kind of bit of regality to her.
Right. Yeah, it's like her color is purple, black, and green, right? Like it's this kind of like
truly Halloween color palette.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah.
I think all this really emphasizes, like, I think she's the best of, like, this era of Disney villain. Because, like, Disney villain's a big thing of, like, you know, people like talking about sort of, like, that cavalcade of people. Because, you know, mostly around this time, you get either, like, your much more classic Disney villain of, like, the Queen in Snow White, who turns into, like, the old evil hag kind of thing. Or you have, like, say, Captain Hook and Peter Pan. Which I would argue, is like, he's a very funny villain. He's probably my favorite of, like, the funnier villains of this time. Hans Conried rules in that movie.
Yeah.
It's one of the few things that, like, holds up about that movie, quite frankly.
The sequence with him and, like, the alligator is probably the best part of that movie. Like, just that whole, like...
I mean, all his stuff where, like, he's got, like, the cigarette holder that has, like, 3 cigarettes at the end of it. And just keep the way he just says, "Smee!" And stuff. He's a very, like, funny villain. But Maleficent feels truly, like, the one you don't want to fuck with of like this early era. Just like, I ain't fucking with Maleficent at all.
Yeah, she feels genuinely like scary and like, I mean, malicious, but like,
Workshop.
Yeah.
I think it's a different name. Close. This is Walt in like 1954 or whatever. Malicious, I don't know. It doesn't sound too good.
Yeah, she should be kind of like bad, almost malicious, you could say.
We've basically kind of gone through the whole movie. So I guess we should maybe start wrapping up here with Sleeping Beauty, because we want to talk about some other ancillary things, like we were teased earlier. But yeah, any final stuff you want to share about Sleeping Beauty? Would you say, like, we like talking about rankings here? Where is this in your like Disney animation rankings?
I think it's at the top, if I'm being honest.
Oh, tip top.
Let me double check.
Because I'll say my ratings kind of shifted a bit as of recent with doing some of this research, particularly with Beauty, which I would argue at this point, looking at my Letterboxd list, it's number 5. So in that top 5, pretty solid. But number 4 is Moana, number 3 is Aladdin, number 2 is Pinocchio, and number 1 is Beauty and the Beast.
Interesting. My number 1 is Sleeping Beauty. My number 5 is Beauty and the Beast.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Then what's in between?
So I got number 4, The Little Mermaid.
Okay.
Number 3, The Emperor's New Groove.
Hey.
I love that movie. I think it's just so fucking good. Number 2, I have The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, the 1977 one.
Right, which is the collection of the various, like the 3 shorts that had been made up to that time.
Yes. Yeah. And number 1 is Sleeping Beauty. It is my favorite of the Disney movies so far. Like, and yeah, this will always like change. I think as I get older, I'm sure I'll like gravitate to some more than others and whatever. But like, I'm sorry, I just remembered one more thing.
One more thing.
I love at the end when they like wake everyone up, and then what's Philip's dad's name?
Hubert, King Hubert.
When he's like, well, this is the 14th century. Like he says it to the to Stefan, which I think is just so
I
funny.
love his mumbling at the end where he's just looking around like, what?
Yeah, it's so great. I love that. But no, yeah, this is my favorite Disney animated movie. Maybe I think it's the one that like it's not my favorite in that like I grew up with like the Renaissance one, so I do have like a bit of nostalgia towards those.
Right.
Especially Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid. My nostalgia and my like love for like Aladdin and The Lion King has kind of waned over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at like the early animation, I think this is one of the most gorgeous animated movies of all time. I mean, we talked a lot about like just how gorgeous this looks and how like ornate it looks, how stunning it is. Like, I mean, I've seen this a few times at this point, and every time I watch it, I just can't help but like get mesmerized by like the backgrounds and like those trees. Like I swear, like next time anyone watches this movie, just look at the trees because they're just so great.
The other flora and fauna.
Yes, yeah. It has a lot of the qualities from like these early movies where you're like, they feel outdated, of course, of like they fall in love after just meeting or whatever, and there are no characters really. Like Philip and Aurora aren't really characters necessarily. They are more like, I don't know, but it feels like a fairy tale really brought to life, and like it feels like they really have the sensibilities of like a fairy tale in a way that like Disney has done fairy tales, and for like so many of their movies are fairy tales, but like they do always do that kind of jokey thing like we talked about where it goes a little too much into that jokey direction for me. But this is a movie that kind of balances that like regal quality and that Disney kind of thing, right? Disney wants to be like family friendly, and also just they have obviously Disney has a certain kind of, what am I trying to say here? A certain
vibe,
yeah, a certain method that they tell their stories with. And I think it walks that line so perfectly for me. I really have grown to love this movie more as I've gotten older. It just surprises me still every time I watch it. And I can say that for some of the early animated movies, but very little of them. So yeah, I love it. I think it's just so stunning. And yeah, it's my favorite. But
yeah. Just to shout out at least a couple things that we didn't really specifically mention. I love those little the gift of blank montages that happen or during that opening bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I give you the gift of song or the gift of beauty, which very abstract gifts to give. I don't know, you spend a lot of money on those. At least Merryweather had the specific one that was very helpful. That made sure she wouldn't die. It's supposed to like, you're gonna look pretty and you're gonna sing. Basically. But I love those montages where like the various different like images are kind of like fading in and out, cross-fading in a way that once again could only happen with like this particular like optical era, where just like that had to take like so much time just to be able to like do the like swirling clouds or like the almost like painting sort of like looks at Aurora and stuff like that. They're very differently stylistically compared to what else happened. I gotta say, shout out to a lady named Alice Davis, who was an actual fashion designer and got her first job here designing clothes for the various different Disney characters. Her design on Princess Aurora's dress, I would argue, the best dress of any of the Disney princesses.
Wow, that is a bold claim.
Because like there's some more traditional with like Cinderella. Like I don't know, I'm not a fashion critic. I don't know. Like Brian can see this, that I don't have the most elaborate fashion designs necessarily, but with like the Disney princess sort of like dress or outfit, it tends to be like just their kind of standard outfit. Like Snow White is that, like her dress, which kind of feels like this is like a casual garb instead of like an actual gown kind of thing she wears the whole movie. Or Cinderella has a bit more of that with like her like fairy godmother dress, kind of feels like the more traditional dress. I love with the one in Sleeping Beauty, like that big collar and like the weird kind of like line designs like on like her chest area. Like it feels much more like what we were talking about, like this regality to it. And also it fits in either pink or blue, which it shifts color often.
I was going to say we have to, well, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the pink or the blue? This is the pressing question here.
Revisiting a very old dead meme. With the dress thing. Do you remember that?
Yes. Is it blue and black, or is it
Right.
is it gold and whatever?
Right, that bullshit. Just like, which do you prefer? I mean, I think the standard has been the pink. Like, whenever I see merchandise of Aurora, it tends to be that pink one.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know, it's like I said, I think it's versatile. It works in either way. I don't think you can say the same thing about, like, if you made Cinderella's dress pink, it would look quite as
Fair.
good. It would look a bit more garish. As opposed
I
to, like,
agree.
the design's universal.
Yeah. I'm a fan of the blue, personally. I agree with Merriweather.
And I do love that, like, that's another thing where that's a simple gag, but in practice, like, whoever's, like, coloring that particular cell has to switch between pink and blue, pink and
God, what
blue.
a nightmare.
Especially when you see, by the way, I love, like, I watch, like, Disney Plus has one of the, like, featurettes, and you see, like, the whole, like, the fact that with cells, they had to, like, paint on the back of them. So, like, you see, like, the backside that has, like, kind of the mushy, like, oh, here's the various different colors. And then when you turn it over, it's got the lines on it. And it looks, like, perfect.
Okay. Right.
I love that aspect of, like, old cell animation. But yeah, and just, you know what? Here's an interesting other little tidbit that relates more to, like, the modern era that I learned from the Disney War book, which I'm currently in the process of listening to the audiobook for. In 1986... they started introducing some of these Disney movies onto home video, like VHS, Betamax, Laserdisc, etc. And that was a big strife point with, like, Michael Eisner and some of the other people involved, where it's like, it was like one of the other, like, younger executives suggested, like, hey, let's do this on video. It's like, are you kidding? We make so much money when we release these in theaters, which Disney would always do. It's like, it was literally like a 7-year period where there would be, like, Sleeping Beauty would, like, be in theatrical release in 59, come back in, I don't know, that would be what, 1966?
66?
Yeah. Right. So it would kind of, like, have that kind of cycle to it, as opposed to, like, introducing on VHS. They were like, okay, well, if we're gonna do this, let's, one, put out movies that weren't very successful at the box office usually, which in this case, Sleeping Beauty and Pinocchio were the first two were put on VHS. Right. And two, we're gonna put these out for, like, $200, so that the only people that'll actually be able to buy these will be rental stores, and then we can get money off the rentals. Even though 100 million video cassettes were sold when they first put both of them out, so that's kind of like the early origin point of, like, the sort of Disney, like, on home media collection. Eventually, we'd get those clamshell VHSs, and then Diamond Edition DVDs. Like, that was so weird. I remember that when I was a kid, where it's like, wait, there was a Diamond Edition, now it's like a Silver Edition.
Platinum Edition.
Platinum, yes, right. There's all these weird, like...
What is it? Does it still have an edition? I don't know if my Blu-ray has, like, a...
That's right, Brian got the Blu-ray from the library. That's how he watched this.
Oh, no, this one I bought.
Oh, you bought it. Okay.
I bought it. I bought it with my own money. But I don't... Hold on, I actually want to see if it has any, like, thing on it.
We're finding this out in real time, everybody. What edition does Brian have of Sleeping Beauty? This is the most DVD dork thing possible.
It is the anniversary edition.
Oh, wow. Very clever. Great title.
It just says the signature collection. Yeah, it's not like the platinum or anything, so...
Guys, you couldn't go for some other element on the periodic table? Just like the magnesium edition or whatever?
Iron,
the hydrogen edition.
Hydrogen.
But yeah, I'll briefly just do my final thoughts here. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think this is definitely one of the better ones, especially it's one that has, as I mentioned, gotten much more fond for me with age. Because there's a lot of those, like I mentioned earlier, like growing up with, like, say, a Peter Pan, watched it all the time, go back to it now, not nearly as great as I thought it was as a small child. Versus, for various reasons, versus Sleeping Beauty is definitely one of those that, like, I agree with you that it feels very much like it was made of this specific time, just given, you know, the cell animation and that particular sort of style of it and everything feels very old, but at the same time, it also feels very timeless in its own weird way. Oh, yeah. Where I think because it's, like, just subversive enough to be like, this is the 14th century and stuff like that, it feels like just subversive enough to be like, okay, this movie knows what it is, but at the same time, it's not gonna, like, constantly jab you about, like, this ain't your daddy's fairy tale story. It's just like, I don't know, like, we're being playful with some of the tropes, and I think that's helped by, like, obviously who our main driving characters are and who we kind of like focus on versus who we don't. I think it does such a great job of truly like making a Disney fairy tale story feel kind of like lively and odd, and it just feels so distinct, not just for Disney animation, but just animation in general. There's few other animated films that look and feel like this one, necessarily.
Yeah.
Which is why, I would recommend, like, if you kind of had a similar standoffish attitude to Sleeping Beauty when you were a kid, it ages like a fine wine.
It does. Yeah. We didn't mention this, but I just thought about this as well, of like, another reason I just never watched these movies is because, like, gender norms, and it was like, oh well, these are the princess movies, those are for girls and stuff like that. And so like I feel like a lot of people haven't seen this movie, maybe because it is kind of one of those like either older movies or it's like a princess movie, so like whatever.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that was very much the case for me, as not only just a boy in the 90s, but also a boy in the 90s with sisters very close in age to me. Who were a bit younger, who were just like, we want to watch The Little Mermaid, we want to watch Beauty and the Beast, and I'm like, Aladdin, because this is for boys. And I put my backwards cap on, and then I went on my little skateboard and immediately fell off it, but within like seconds.
And then you were like, tubular. I don't know, it's the 90s, right? So
but yeah, so let's address the element of, like, obviously this is a classic Disney movie, and like many a classic Disney movie, it's had live action, not necessarily remake, which I think is like what's fascinating with Maleficent, which came out in 2014, starring Angelina Jolie, and also the sequel, Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, which I rewatched Maleficent, and I watched Mistress of Evil for the first time as well, kind of in prep for this.
Okay.
I will say, when Maleficent came out initially, almost a decade ago, I really hated it. As someone who, around this time is when I really started getting into Sleeping Beauty. I was like, oh, this is one of the unheralded masterpieces. And I was just like, well, the fairies, they've made into assholes, and they do this and this that's different, and I hate it and I don't like it. Revisiting it now, after the onslaught of Disney remakes that try and recreate the original as much as possible, except for whenever they want to include very thin ideas of progressivism. It's just like, see, we're different. We're not like those old fairy tales. We have a couple people of color. Do they do much? Nope.
Are they characters? Nope.
They are actors who we hired to stand there, basically, for the most part. And with Maleficent, as much as I don't think that movie still works at all, I think it has like some very wonky casting decisions with, say, Charlton Copley. This was peak, like, we gotta put him in something, and it's not, a great substitute for the Stefan in Sleeping Beauty. It doesn't quite fit. But at the same time, it's different angle, focusing on Maleficent, kind of telling, like, oh, this is the story from her point of view, and having, like, that Jolie performance and some other things, at least makes it, like, the bar is so low for these modern Disney remakes. I'm like, well, fuck, you guys are trying something. It's not 100% effective, but you have a take. That's not just, let's do the original again.
Right, it does feel so weird, because, like, up until this point, they had only really made Alice in Wonderland, and, like...
Alice in Wonderland, and...
Well, I guess if you want to count the Glenn Close 101 Dalmatians, which I've never seen.
That's true.
But,
that was a childhood staple of mine, and it's definitely just, like, it's a 90s kids movie with a great Glenn Close performance in it, basically.
Okay, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's, like, all they had done up until this point, right? When they made Maleficent?
Yeah, this is right before Cinderella, the Kenneth Branagh Cinderella.
Yeah, it's the year before Cinderella. So, yeah, like, it does feel weird looking. I did not rewatch this, by the way. I forgot that there were two Maleficent movies, and I saw both of them in theaters. But, yeah, but it's weird to think about now, these movies existing, and it's like, at least it is a different take on, like, the story. I remember the visual effects being pretty decent. I don't know, have they held up at all?
I mean, I would say whenever it's focused on, say, like, Maleficent and her sort of darker appearance, when she becomes more villainous, I think it works a lot better than, like, the opening bits where it's like, it's young Maleficent flying around in, like, a fairy tale land. That shit looks rough.
Yeah, I remember that looking rough at the time.
Yeah, especially they focus so much on this little girl who they have in, like, a harness, like, flying around, because Maleficent has wings in this version. And it's just like, oh, this is not... Dude, you're like jerking this kid around on like a blue screen. It feels really weird.
God, I don't remember anything about the first Maleficent movie.
I will give them credit for there's the whole bit that I remember was at least like there was a lot of talk around sort of the subtext of it. The whole opening, I guess like this is in the opening, like I don't know, like 10, 15 minutes of the movie, where Charlotte Copley, her love, great chemistry, Jolie and Charlotte Copley, her childhood love, like reunite with each other, and she, sleeps next to him for the night, and then she wakes up, he's gone, and so are her wings, which have been clipped, and she starts screaming in panic and horror, which obviously there's a lot of implications to that about like sexual assault and rape, kind of metaphor stuff there, and that is very bold, I would say, for especially like one of these modern Disney live action remakes, where it's like that's like something none of these other movies would even dare to attempt.
Yeah, fair. Yeah.
And you believe at least a lot of that anguish from Julie. Like I said, I think as we keep going, because like, my whole thing with Maleficent at this point now is I think that first like 20 to 30 minutes is like, this is like a lot more interesting, at least than I remember. It's not all great, but it's at least kind of fascinating. And then the more we keep going and we introduce like that her raven turns into a sexy Sam Riley.
Sam Claflin. Or Sam Riley, yeah.
Right, turns into sexy Sam Riley and then turns into the dragon at the end, which is still dumb. Just like, why can't she just
I forgot that happened.
Yeah, he's the one who turns into the dragon at the very end. It's really dumb. I don't like it. Even just like I still don't like the bumbling fairies, even though 3 great actresses, Imelda Staunton, Leslie Manville, and Gino Temple play.
God, oh my God.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Right. And then, also Elle Fanning, as Aurora, she's there. And it does kind of do, I remember at the time I was very pissed off of like, oh, they're just doing the Frozen thing with like the twist that like, not the kiss from the prince that wakes up Aurora, but from Maleficent.
Yes.
Right. But,
yeah.
Which is like, I think it feels like, I don't know, maybe like shared thinking at the same time kind of thing. But also it is interesting how it is a movie about Angelina Jolie kind of finding like a true love in the form of like an adopted daughter. Just kind of interesting. Yeah. That's another layer to it.
Yeah, I remember I was on the Elle Fanning train at this point, I think, when I watched this movie, so like I was excited. I was like, oh my God, Elle Fanning is in it and everything. I remember her being good. I remember just like the movie being like mostly held up by Angelina Jolie's performance.
Yeah.
Which I remember being pretty like good at the time, but I feel like it is what's doing most of the heavy lifting in that movie.
100% fair with that.
Yeah.
And then leading into Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, which is such a movie that doesn't exist at all.
I saw it in theaters, in Dolby, and it doesn't exist.
No, it does not exist whatsoever. And because it came out like 2019 versus 2014, so like 5 years, pretty big gap. And it came out like right before the pandemic. It was like October 2019. So it's one of those like truly memory hold movies of like that particular time. But I did watch it, and it is, I think, kind of interesting in terms of one, it's the only one that's on Disney Plus. The original Maleficent isn't on Disney Plus currently, which I found weird.
That's weird. That is weird.
Very odd. But also, like, I think it's a worse movie than Maleficent, because like we're mentioning, it's not nearly as shockingly, I know, but it does have at least an interesting turn I was not expecting. Because if you don't know, basically in this Maleficent sequel, it's weirdly starts off like it's Meet the Parents, where it's like Prince Philip, who's a completely different actor now. It's not Brendan Thwaites anymore. It's the other guy from...
It's Harris Dickinson.
Right.
Which, I mean, he's great. I love him.
Right. The lead of the Triangle of Sadness.
Triangle of Sadness,
right.
The King's Man. He's going to be in the Iron Claw. He's like a big star now, I hope.
Right, but they end up like finally getting together. Even though I love in the original Maleficent, like my favorite thing is that the prince is truly treated as a prop, because like he tries to come up to Maleficent just saying like, "Hey, I want to help out and get Aurora," and she puts him to sleep, conks him out, and he's like floating, and then he's only woken up to like, "Hey, kiss the princess." Oh, it didn't work, and then they throw him out of the movie, which I think is great. Yeah, and then they're together though in the sequel, and it's like, we're gonna be married. He proposes, and then Maleficent has to meet with the king and queen, this version of Hubert, and his wife, played by Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yes.
And while there's an awkward dinner, and the king falls ill, and Michelle Pfeiffer tries to say, like, oh, it's Maleficent cursed him. That's what happened here. Even though it's actually a big twist on Michelle Pfeiffer's actually the one causing all these spells with her buddy Warwick Davis, who plays, like, I believe they say he's a fairy, and he's, like, a weird, like, turncoat from the magic world, who, like, wants to be part of the human world, because Michelle Pfeiffer's big plan is we're gonna have the wedding happen, we're gonna invite all the fairy tale creatures and bring them in first, and then when we're gonna close the doors, and we're gonna literally gas them to death with, like, out of the organ this, like, fairy magic that's gonna kill them. So literally just, like, trying to genocide fairy tale creatures. That's very interesting. I didn't expect that.
I remember watching this in theaters, and this was a time when I was just kind of like, I think I worked at the movies, so I, like, was just watching anything that came out. I was like, I'll watch it. It's free. And it is such a weird movie. It's not good, right? Like, you don't like this movie, and I also, from my memory, don't like it. But it is at least making a lot of, like, very weird and interesting choices. Especially, like, I remember the final, like, battle, like, climax being very, like, visually kind of striking. From my memory, it's been a while, and it's been a pandemic away. But is it still good, or that sequence at least?
I don't know. It felt very much like a big Disney climax of, this modern era, I would say, which is, like, the action's a lot more choppy. It doesn't, like, really cohere that well. I think the editing's really terrible in that whole sequence. But to be fair, like, my least favorite thing about it is more like, because the detail I didn't mention is, while all this is going on, Maleficent has fucked off elsewhere, and now she has her wings back after the end of the first movie, so she then finds her kind, which is, like, she thought she was the only one possible. She's like Tigger. She's like, the wonderful thing about Maleficent.
Yes.
Because I'm the only one. But it turns out there's a whole, like, underground race of, like, these, flying, winged, humanoid creatures. It's like the Dark Fae, I think is what they're called, like Fae.
Isn't Chiwetel Ejiofor one of them?
Yep. Chiwetel Ejiofor is, like, the lead, who's just like, you have been prophesized, Maleficent. You are our true savior. And it's like, oh, Chiwetel.
That's the part I remember just being like, I'm out. I'm checked out of this movie.
I don't want lore like that. Like, if you're going to do weird lore, I prefer, like, the whole setup of, like, oh, the king and her, this initial, like, puppy love thing that turned into something awful, as opposed to, like, many eons ago, you were the chosen. I'm like, who cares?
Yeah. I'd forgotten about that, and I really disliked that part of the movie. But I liked other aspects. I think a lot of, like, the costume design is pretty good in that movie, from what I remember.
Also, a big shout out, it's one of the last Rick Baker makeup designs, is Maleficent.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh.
Like, Angelina Jolie's sort of look that has, like, those cheekbones that could stab you in the face kind of thing. But, yeah, and that carries over into Mr. Sequel. But at the same time, all those problems with, like, those two movies, I would still say they're upper echelon of those, like, remakes. Not a high bar at all.
Oh, 1000%. Yeah.
But it still is, like, I would say in the top 5 of those, because it's not Pinocchio or Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast. There's no scuttlebutt bullshit in this movie.
Christ. But it also isn't like Pete's Dragon, which is a great movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely one of the... And also I would say Kenneth Branagh's Cinderella, which also is not on Disney Plus. And I think is one of the... It's just like, they just do a better version of, like, Cinderella for that time.
Yeah, I've never seen it, despite the idea of Cate Blanchett playing the evil stepmother being, like, the most appealing thing in the world to me.
She rules in it. Yeah, and Lily James, just one of my favorite actresses currently working, honestly, right now. But yeah, I think it's a better sort of, like, twist on, like, oh, it's the villain kind of, like, from her perspective story than, like, Cruella, which is another one that's just, like, truly memory hold. I remember, like, the dog thing at the beginning that became a meme, where the dogs, like, basically chase after her mother and, like, make her fall over a cliff.
Yeah, that movie is kind of frustrating, because I really love Emma Stone, obviously, and I think she's, like, giving it her all, but, like, I don't know. I'm just so, like, uninterested in, like, what that movie is, really. That, like, yeah, none of that movie interests me at all, but...
No.
Yeah.
Though, by the way, I did want to say we did forget about one of the other weird Disney live action things that technically counts, even though it's a very like backwards example. In between Maleficent and Alice in Wonderland, there was Nicolas Cage and the Sorcerer's Apprentice,
Which I've never seen.
which is technically a live action remake. There's literally a whole bit where like Jay Baruchel is our Mickey stand-in, and he makes the mops come to life.
Wait, that's what that movie is?
Yes. Nicolas Cage is supposed to be like, what's his name, Yensid, that the
His
sorcerer
like,
with the
master,
hat,
right?
and everything.
Like,
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah. Alfred Molina's the villain. It's very bad. It's the movie that killed National Treasure 3 from happening, because that was like Jerry Bruckheimer, Nick Cage, when they're like, we're gonna do this first, and that bombed so hard.
Weird. Teresa Palmer, Monica
Yep.
Bellucci, Toby Kebbell.
Yep.
It's on Disney Plus. Maybe I'll watch this.
You do that. Have fun with that. But yeah, so you know what? Let's get into, like, we're done with all this talk of like Disney live action stuff. We're done talking about it. Let's talk about some good Disney movies that we're going to recommend in our segment Between the Lines. So every episode, Bryan and I recommend another film that sort of fits with the letter criteria of the episode or is tangentially related to the movie that we're covering. And Bryan, you're going to go ahead and start here. What is your pick?
So my pick is another movie kind of from this early Walt period, and a movie I didn't really watch a lot growing up. I never watched it. I watched it for the first time when I was in like high school maybe, and it's one I've just kept thinking about, and I rewatched it yesterday for this podcast, and it is Fantasia, because I just was blown away rewatching this again. I had watched it like years ago in high school for the first time, and it was like a weird thing. I didn't really know what it was. I didn't really know much about it, but I didn't get it at the time. I just was very perplexed by it. I didn't really know what it was, and then rewatching it this time, it's stuck in my head. I was really just blown away by Fantasia. It feels truly like Disney trying to elevate animation into like as an art form, and really just Fantasia as a whole feels like just real genuine art. I mean, just the mixture of classical music and the animation is so great. I still, to this day, when I envision Mickey Mouse in my head, I envision him with the like wizard's hat, like always, and the robe. That was just always how I like envisioned him as a kid. And like that sequence is so iconic and so incredible. But like the Greek mythology segment, which is so like weird and interesting and gorgeous, and like the Rite of Spring section, which I love. I just really was blown away by this again, even though I had already seen it. It's so incredible and really feels unique in that there's nothing like Fantasia, really. I don't think, like, even still. I mean,
Excuse me, Fantasia 2000, sir. What if there was a Fantasia in 2000?
And this is a no, by the way. Could we do a series of movies of like just 2000, right? Because there's a bunch of movies of like.
That doesn't quite fit with like our classic structure.
I mean, that's true. Fuck.
Or our indie structure, really, or our modern structure. Well, it kind of fits modern, but I don't know.
It could.
We'll cover. Don't worry. I know you want to cover Blues Brothers 2000 so badly. We definitely will.
But yeah, but Fantasia feels so unique, and like I really like Fantasia 2000, which I should watch again. I really only remember the Rhapsody in Blue section from that movie.
That's the masterpiece.
It is, absolutely. But even like this movie, which is very long, like I was really struck by how long Fantasia was. I forgot it was like just over 2 hours long, and like, but like every section feels so powerful and so unique and so powerful almost. Like I don't know. It feels like a real piece of art is how I keep thinking about it, and interesting to think about Disney making this. Yeah, I loved it.
I think with Fantasia, I remember when I was a kid, that was kind of like my introduction to just classical music in general.
Sure.
And I remember it kind of like gave me that vague impulse of like, oh, I can imagine like a story set to like this music without any like dialogue into it. So that I can let like my kind of mind wander with the music when I like ever listen to classical music. And I will say I like all of the segments in Fantasia. I think there are some I prefer, I would say. Like I would Sorcerer's Apprentice, Rites of Spring with the Dinosaurs, which rules. It's
Hell
amazing.
yes.
And then of course, Night on Bald Mountain is like one of the best pieces of animation. Like that fucking Chernabog with like the way that he is just animated. It's like one of the best examples, especially of like a, you know, that sort of subversive angle of Disney where it's like, oh my god, there are demons and some of them are naked and they have boobs. Which was wild to me seeing it when I was younger. And also just an interesting one in that some of the uncomfortable stuff has been scrubbed out of existence. Let's say like the Greek mythology segment with like the centaurs.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Originally, there were a couple centaurs who feel a bit uncomfortable. Very like stereotypical of say black audiences at the time. Yeah.
I mean,
Not great.
look.
And it's been erased from history, though. Disney has very much tried to scrub that out. It's not in like any of the home video releases. It's gone, pretty much. That character is like totally scrubbed out. It feels like Disney kind of like, let's sweep this under the rug. We never did that. Not there. We're not confronting it at all.
Fantasia doesn't have like the disclaimer, I think, because I also watched
No.
Alice in Wonderland. I think that's the one that has the disclaimer.
Even though in Alice in Wonderland, it's mostly like the smoking, right?
I think it is. I don't think there's anything like, yeah.
There's not like
I think it
Siamese
is-
cats from Lady and the Tramp type shit
God.
in that one, I don't think. No.
Oh man.
But regardless, I still think Fantasia overall, yeah, it is one of the tops, I would say, of that early Walt era of Disney. And you know that iconography you're talking about with Mickey Mouse, I remember very distinctly. Speaking to the theme parks angle of it, guess what, guys? It's a Disney series. Gonna bring up theme parks again.
Yeah.
But at particularly originally MGM Studios, now Hollywood Studios, had two distinctive things. One, for a while, the sort of icon of it was a giant Mickey Mouse like ears thing, like him with the big sorcerer hat. It was like the two ears and the sorcerer hat, like right in the middle of the park, and then like a hand that had like a wand. And then as part of the Great Movie Ride, the one sort of Disney thing you see on that ride is a bit of like Mickey Mouse in the middle of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice magic stuff, which is on like a big screen.
Cool.
In between animatronics of famous celebrities, which we might talk about that in some other form, put a pin in that. But yeah, Fantasia though, great movie. But
Absolutely.
I have one here that similarly, it's an anthology film from the 40s, about 10 years before Sleeping Beauty came out. This is one of the package films that I was mentioning earlier, sort of these anthology segmented, like different shorts basically put together. This one is just a doubleheader, only 2 segments, both adapted from classic works of literature. I have The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which was the last package film that basically it's just these 2 shorts that are adaptations of The Wind in the Willows, initially, and then the second segment, an adaptation of Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And they're both narrated by famous people, where Basil Rathbone of Sherlock Holmes fame does narration for The Wind in the Willows, though there's a lot of classic Disney voice actors in that. And then Legend of Sleepy Hollow, all of the characters pretty much are voiced by Bing Crosby, who narrates and then sort of supplies the interior dialogue for a lot of these characters, like Ichabod and everybody. And I remember this is one I watched a lot as a kid, and I will say, I think of the 2 segments, Wind in the Willows is the weaker one, but I still think it's fun. This is obviously where, like, Mr. Toad is this character who I've read the original story of When the Willows, but this is my introduction. In this animated version, Mr. Toad is a fucking maniac because he's obsessed with, like, initially his horse and cart, and he's buddies with his very British horse, and then they spot a motorcar driving around. He becomes, like, addicted, like, I have to buy that car. I have to do it. And I love all the animation on Mr. Toad, and the various, like, Badger and Mole, the two sort of, like, buddies of his that go chasing after him. And then the weasels, sort of, like, this is the early example of, like, the weasels we would later get in Roger Rabbit, previously covered on the show.
Of
it's like the
course.
henchmen.
My best friends.
Yes, and your best friend. They understand me. And it's a fun segment, but pound for pound, I think The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is one of my favorite just pieces of Disney animation of all time. It's got that kind of cartoony aesthetic to it. It has a bit more of, like, a very unlikable protagonist in Ichabod, who is just very outwardly like, I like having sex with ladies, and I like eating their food, and I'm a gold digger who really wants
Nice.
to be with Katrina, the local rich girl. So I can, like, there's a whole, like, bit where he's talking about, like, oh, Katrina, I can't wait to have, like, be with you in these fields of wheat that look like gold. Money. that I can have once your dad dies. And stuff. He is truly, like, despicable as a character. But he's, like, so funny. And all the songs of, like, very Bing Crosby sort of, like, era of that music. I have a soft spot for that particular kind of music of that era. One of my favorite Disney songs is the Headless Horseman main theme, which is done as, like, Brom Bones, who's, like, sort of the guy who's trying to get Katrina as well, that's local to town. Just tells the legend of Sleepy Hollow and just the whole, like, breakdown of it. And then the climax where Ichabod is chased by the Headless Horseman. I think all that stuff, it's some of the best character animation in Disney. It's some of the best, like, horror stuff in Disney. I would argue this was a very early example of me getting into horror as a kid. Where it's just like, this is spooky, this is unnerving, but, like, in a way that it feels, like, so ethereal at the time, to the degree that I always watch at least the Sleepy Hollow bit every Halloween. I think it's just genuinely, like, some of the best kind of, like, autumn, spooky, unnerving kind of feel. Also some great, like, early comedy stuff that kind of, like, eases you in before the horror really takes over. I think this is easily the best of the package films. Most of those you can skip. There are, like, individual segments that are kind of fun, but they're mostly whiffs, quite frankly. And especially with, like, the Saludos Amigos, kind of racist as well, shockingly.
Oh, sure, yeah, I can imagine.
Time. Yeah, as opposed to Ichabod and Mr. Toad, I think, is, like, the one of those I would recommend to anybody, and particularly for the Sleepy Hollow segment alone. I think is, like, just one of my favorite things Disney has made in general. And the Mr. Toad one's fun.
I skipped the package movies when I did my whole Disney run through, mainly because, yeah, I kind of assumed that they were all just kind of, like, not very memorable or worth watching. But I might check this one out. I will check this one out, actually, because it does seem like the only one that I would really have any interest in, I think.
Plus, there's only 2 stories, and the movie's, like a lot of these old Disney movies, it's 68 minutes long. It's barely over an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, let's go ahead and repeat our titles for everybody out there.
Yes, I had the 1940 movie Fantasia from Disney.
And I had the 1949 film The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, also from Disney. We're going to start wrapping up here, so while we do that, we want to thank some people, like Burial Grid for our intro music. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com, including his new album, which just came out, like, literally when we posted our last episode of the previous season, Waves of the Quietus. Great name.
Cool.
Wonderful album artwork as well. I'd recommend you all purchase. And also thanks to Michelle Kyle for her artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. Thank you, Michelle, for giving me a great background from which I can add dumb photoshops to. For, like, very bad, like, just place a character in front of the seats of the show. And, of course, also thanks to our Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you get access to bonus episodes that we put out over there, bonus audio tracks, and also you get to vote in polls for stuff, like one of the later episodes of the season was chosen by our patrons. And over on the Patreon, some of the bonus audio you might be able to hear. We would have already released our audio review, I believe, for The Killer, which we haven't seen yet. We're very excited for the David Fincher movie. And also, we're going to definitely do some kind of like big review roundup thing near the end of the month, because a lot of Oscar stuff's coming out, and Brian and I are trying to watch as many of that stuff. I'll just say I think one we'll definitely mutually cover. We haven't talked about this, but we've both seen Priscilla.
Oh my god.
I think we'll definitely at least...
So fucking good.
I'll save it for the Patreon.
I mean, I don't know.
I'm not sure of my thoughts yet. No, we'll find, it's not like these are on Letterboxd or anything. But yeah, we'll probably have like a big sort of like roundup of stuff that's released in November that we'll talk about, and also we'll be talking about a more subversive version of a fairy tale with Into the Woods, the Stephen Sondheim musical, specifically the 1991 stage recording. We'll be talking about in detail, though. We'll also probably bring up the movie Disney produced, which, as like sort of a comparison point, but we'll be talking about. That's our big bonus podcast for the month. And, look forward to stuff as we get into December for more Disney-related material. We'll announce in the future. And all that for just $1. You get access to all that stuff over there. It really helps out, keeps the show afloat, as it were. Keeps us in an awoken state, as it were. Not sleeping. And you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at cinema2letter. Any of those socials, Blue Sky, also as well. We're over there. Cinema2letter once again. And you can find me on most socials as at Not the Who's Tommy. And I also do some writing on marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com.
You can find me on Twitter at BRYANDRADE, followed by the number 3. Or you follow me on Letterboxd at my name. See my published list for 2023, which is up. I just left it up this year, public, where you can look at. Yeah, there's a lot of cool movies out. So just trying to watch all of them and definitely rank all of them, because that's the best part, really. You gotta rank them.
As was very clear from us talking about Disney ranking bullshit, we like
It's
lists. We like doing that. And you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms to keep listening. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you might listen to all the other great shows here on the network, including, like I said, Dream a Little Deeper. Wow, the great Disney podcast. They're kind of sporadic with their release. They kind of like they did a second season a couple of years ago that ended up with Fox and the Hound. So they haven't gotten to the Disney Renaissance era yet. Whenever they return, I'm sure it'll be fun. Alex and Tara, shout out to them. And you can also dig into our archives on our Podbean main feed for the first 2 seasons of this show, and all the old Double Edge Double Bill stuff is all archived on there, and you can listen. And if nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight, but the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility, and to make sure that we don't get pricked too easily by a spinning wheel.
Oh no, Thomas, watch out, there's a spinning wheel appearing magically in front of you.
Oh, I don't know, I'm so drawn to it. Why did it turn green all of a sudden? My light bulb isn't green. Oh, well, on that note, everybody, we should tease our next episode is our Eye for Indie for Disney, which is, we decided to shuffle things around with distinguishing indie for a major conglomerate like Disney, celebrating, we should mention its 100th anniversary. We didn't mention that's why we're doing Disney this season.
Yep. Happy birthday, Disney.
Happy birthday. Doing great. Great year for Disney. The Eye for Indie pick that we're talking about is from a Disney sort of subsidiary that was acquired by them, and then this subsidiary, Miramax, ended up releasing Clerks in 1994, an episode behind the curtain we've already recorded. That was the first one we recorded due to guest availability with Tori DePina. Shout out. A lot of fun with that episode. I've edited it. It is going to be our longest episode because there's a lot of Kevin Smith lore. A lot of that.
Yeah, and you get to hear me watch the 3 Clerks movies for the first time.
Yes, so. That's the experiment we tested for Brian. Of the View Askew movies, he only watched the 3 movies with Clerks in the title.
Right, because I had previously never seen a Kevin Smith movie.
Yes. So we decided to just do the 3 movies work as an individual trilogy? Find out next time.
Find out.
Yes. But until then, Brian, it's time we leave people on this note, this distant, once upon a dream note, as we float off in blue or pink. Where do we go with? Make it blue?
Make it blue.
I don't know. Make it pink.
Make it blue.
Make it pink.